Hello everyone, and welcome to Books Undone. I'm your host, Livia J. Elliot, and today we are starting a new series, Authors Spotlight. Here, I interview authors to do deep dives into the themes in their works. To kickstart the series, let me introduce you to the View author and fellow Oshi, Joshua Walker. Thank you so much for joining me. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Livia. Absolutely. My name's Josh Walker. I have been writing for many, many, many years. But my first book recently came out in January, which is a novella. It's called The Rest to the Gods. And it's kind of my attempt at doing a really character-focused epic fantasy. That's primarily driven by a theme. The main series that this novella relates to is called The Song of the Sleepers, and it comes out. Well, the first book is going to come out hopefully in the middle of this year, around June or July. That book is called An Exile of Water and Gold. And for me, that book is a bit of an exploration of a few different things. It's an exploration of love, firstly, but also it's an exploration of science. So there's a lot of science in that book, which is something that you see glimpses of in the novella that I want to carry forward through the series.
That sounds amazing, honestly. I'm even more hyped now. So before diving into the talk, let me do the usual disclaimers. First, there are spoilers in this podcast, but they only affect Joshua's debut novella, The Rest to the Gods. We won't go into spoilers for his upcoming book or the series. Second, remember that what we discuss here is our subjective opinion, even the authors. You are allowed to disagree with us. That said, can we start with Nisha? I found her to be very intriguing. We get to see her both as a young and insecure girl, but also as a powerhouse of a war hero. I want to know, how was it for you to explore the psyche of both the young and the older Nisha? And if you find it hard to make the character growth believable and earned?
That's a really good question. For me, Nisha is probably the character that if I think about, and you have to remember, I wrote this novella after writing book one, actually. So this is a really recent write for me. So I'd already explored Nisha a little bit through that lens. But for me, she is definitely quite similar to myself, right? Like I've painted a portrait of myself in many ways in her character. Not necessarily in her background or anything like that. So, you don't want to read too much into it, but her personality definitely speaks to me the most. So I think, seeing that the character reflects the author, meant that it was quite, I guess, natural for me to be able to write two storylines that represented her childhood and her young adulthood, because I just had to self-reflect. With other characters, you don't get that privilege, right? With Nisha, it was pretty special. And I felt that way even going back now and editing book one, I've felt that connection to that character, which I definitely don't have with the others. Yeah, which is pretty special, yeah.
If we follow that theme in the present timeline, we see Nisha that is very adult, and she's close to 100 years, I think. And she's still carrying some things from her childhood. So I would like to explore the childhood, the young Nisha first. I found her to be, very mature for her age, especially as you reveal the situation of her mother being verbally abusive to her, the father being a drunkard, and her being responsible for her sister. I found that quite realistic, It felt that her maturity wasn't due to life experience, but it was enforced because of her situation. It felt like a need. I think that you did that superbly. So would you like to share a bit more of what went into it?
Yeah, once again, I think it goes back to that natural tendency as part of the human condition that when you are forced into a situation, you have to respond with the best that you can, right? And so she's really a character that, for me, when I was writing the novella, I was trying nearly in every scene to push the stakes up as quickly as I could. And part of that is story structure. Like, this is a very short story, so the stakes need to rise quickly. But in doing that, it means that she has to keep up with it. It worked out well, because when I was going back through the first round of edits on the novella, I quickly realized that, she's adapting quickly, but it's realistic and it's hard. It's a portrait of a hard life. And I think there's also this interesting dichotomy where she is very quickly moved from being a common person in her society to becoming essentially a noble woman. And it's not something that she understands. And it's an interesting thing to play with, because typically you see people go from riches to rags. You see that opposite story where maybe they start off in a position of wealth and they end up in a position of poverty. And not to say that that's not as hard, but I think going the other way with her was important because she starts so young. And so you see that natural evolution of how she deals with challenges, right? And how she grows in resilience.
There is also the disbelief that she had at several points that she was still the same person as before, and it keeps carrying on to the point in which her tutor takes her back to her family and they see her in a completely different light. And it's not until that point that she doesn't realize, or at least that's how I interpret it, that only then she actually realizes that new position that she has.
I think there's also that thing of, I really wanted to capture naivety, but it's hard to do that in a book that's not written for children. Do you know what I mean? So like, this is obviously aimed at adults. And I was trying to find ways to tell a complex story without dumbing it down too much. Like, I didn't want it to read like we were coming, I guess, directly from her point of view, because she doesn't know at that point how hard things are or what the reality of her situation is until she's faced with it. And that's part of being a child. And that's something that definitely resonates with me. So yeah, for her, it was all about getting that resilience to come through slowly in a believable way. It did mean that I had to distance the reader a little bit from being directly in her eyes, because I felt like if I got too close, you'd start to lose a bit of that believability, right? Because later when you see her as an adult, the story does read quite differently, and I wanted her character to be consistent from the start to the end.
If I can read one of the sentences, I actually really like this one, and it ties a bit into what you were saying. This is when she goes back to her family, and her tutor had said they don't want you here and so on, but she was still not believing them, and she says she hadn't believed them, but she also knew she didn't want to find out the truth. Not then, not now either, if the truth was to be the one she feared the most. It captures that naivete that you mentioned. But to me, it also kind of captured a traumatic response. She had this idea of her parents loved her, even when through the situation, we can clearly see that that's not the case. And then at this point, a few paragraphs after, you get the shock of reality of the tutor was actually right.
Yeah, and I think you touch on a really good point there. I think, like, when I was writing that scene in particular, I tried to figuratively associate exactly what you're talking about with that physical moment of her stepping between the door of the home and the outside world, or vice versa, right? When she comes into the house, there's a change, there's a tonal change where she gets to be the girl who doesn't quite understand on one side of the door, and on the other, she has to grow up and do it quickly, because if she doesn't, that really threatens her coping mechanisms, essentially. And I think there's also that interplay between sibling love, right? Like, I didn't get to probably develop it as much as I would have liked, just because of the length of the story. But it was definitely something I wanted to show the reader was this is not just about the parents. Nisha's response to her parents, I think she's pretty good at adapting to how challenging they can be, but adapting to how that affects her younger sister is an entirely different matter. And that does come from past trauma as well. So the death of her brother is a part of that. But yeah, like I was mentioning before, I think there's that physical moment where she steps beyond the barrier of the door, and that's where everything kind of changes.
It actually even changes the narrator. Like, the voice becomes a bit more formal as soon as she starts, when before she was even saying that she couldn't move. Part of her was just moving without her controlling it. And once she crosses the threshold, it's far more formal. It's that voice that doesn't feel like a child. It feels like someone forced to grow up. And the sisterly love, it was very nice. And it also conveyed how responsible Nisha felt.
Absolutely. I think there's also that human thing where it's hard to put this into words, but there are moments, I think in everyone's life, where there's someone that you're particularly close with. And sometimes it doesn't matter who the person is. They could be, a boyfriend or girlfriend, or they could be just a friend, or they could be a parent. It doesn't matter. But if you do have a relationship breakdown with that person, there's that scary moment where they become someone that you don't quite know anymore. And that's really unsettling, right? Because you feel like you're a part of this person in some way. And when they take that step back, I think that's personally quite confronting. So I really wanted to show that with her, where her sister, when she comes into the house, is so normal and excited to see her.
Yeah.
But the rest of the tone in that house is so dreary, dark, foreboding nearly. And it's that moment where I think she sees her parents in a different light, and it makes her realize why she can't be there anymore. But at the same time, there's that conflict of, well, I can't be there anymore, but I still want to go back. And so Colin had to basically force her to go and see what the other side of life is like.
Yeah, and even before that, still in the then timeline, in the past one, she was constantly thinking that the tutor had lied to her, that the family still wanted her. And when she goes there, it feels, even when with what he says, I told you so, in a more elegant way, it actually feels like that. And when I read it the first time,
wow.
I was actually dreading the scene because I could see that the mother was going to leash on her. I think you convey the whole scene very well without getting explicit, without actually making something that could be a trigger, but it actually has the whole emotional power. One question regarding that, how did you manage not to be so explicit, but actually put all the emotional value in it?
Yeah, I think, if we go back to that idea of writing naturally, right, and writing what you know, for me, if I evaluate myself as a person, I'm a creative person, and a lot of creative people, not everyone, but a lot of creative people are melancholic in their temperament. And what that means is that, I tend to be very reflective. I tend to ruminate a lot on the bad stuff and reflect a lot on the good stuff. And I tend to kind of, overthink. And I think with Nisha, I really wanted to convey that. But at the same time, there's a contrast there where there is self-imposed ignorance on her character, right? There's a level of, she just doesn't want to go there, and that self-imposed ignorance, actually, I can reference a text, The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss is actually, it's one of my favorite books. I've read that book probably 6 or 7 times. Actually, maybe more than that, now that I think about it. But the thing with Quoth in that book is that he's so ignorant, and so many of his problems come from his ignorance. And I think with Nisha, I didn't want her to be as kind of bravado as Quoth at all. I wanted her to be more human. It's funny that I'm saying that because she's technically not a human, but you know what I mean. But she is very ignorant, and that gets her into trouble. And I think there's that interplay of naivety, which is something that she can't help, and then ignorance, which is something that, she knows the truth, but she doesn't want to go there. And that stuff comes back to haunt her in the present timeline in the novella as well.
Yeah. Regarding the present timeline, I didn't notice when I read it the first time. On the second read, she only thinks of her sister. When she thinks of her family, it's only the sister. She never mentions the parents. I found it lovely in the sense that after everything that happened, after so many years, because it's after a century, she still has her sister in her heart. She's still caring about her.
I really appreciate that you said that, because I think one of the things that I find a lot of times, especially with the Aobian people in this series, is that because they age so much slower than humans, sometimes it's hard to make their emotions believable, because in a human sense, you kind of get past this stuff much quicker. Whereas with her, she's, like you say, she's nearly a century old at the end, and yet she's still struggling with this stuff. I think I was considering a lot the weight of being a sufferer of post-traumatic stress disorder, right? And I guess that ability that the brain has in trauma situations to actually block entire parts of your history out. And so I think that's kind of where we leave Nisha at the end is there's definitely healing that's happened. There's definitely also protected love, sisterly love. She hasn't seen her sister in years, but then at the same time, she still cares for her. But exactly as you say, I did not want to draw attention to the parents at all. I kind of wanted to show that and leave it up to the reader ultimately to decide whether she has blocked that out subconsciously or whether she's actually chosen to step past that pain.
Even in the present timeline, she reads more mature and different and with different life experiences, but she still has some thoughts that link back to those traumatic responses or learned behaviors, those coping mechanisms from her youth. Like, she's always very perfectionist and has this tendency to feel responsible for everyone, even when everyone else are adults making their own decisions. And she's, at some point, it felt distressingly motherly, in the sense of very protective, but it also felt linked to that past.
I think you said something very clever there when you mentioned that motherly instinct thing, I definitely wanted to draw an allusion to her mother and show how I guess her influence still precedes her, right? And not that it entirely governs Nisha's character at all, but there is that aspect of is she living in the shadow of her parents, right? Or I guess where she came from. In addition to that, she's very headstrong. She is very brooding, kind of, yeah, do you know what I mean? And so she's definitely a glass half empty kind of person as well, which is, once again, that's a similar trait of mine. And I think there are moments where, you know, she probably thinks that yeah, she does have to look after everybody. That's entirely her responsibility. It's completely unfair. Once again, it's self-imposed ignorance, right? But it's of a much, I guess, worse kind, or high, you know, a worse gravity there, because of her age, her maturity, and what she's dealing with in the present timeline. The stakes are so much higher. And so many other people's lives are on the line. So there's that natural feeling of, well, I need to do the best I can. But also, the more you tell yourself that, the worse of a job you're going to do.
Yeah, and there is a theme in the present timeline that I think actually represents that. She has a wounded person, the enemies are incoming, and she has this idea of helping one, not helping the others, and helping everybody at the same time, until she gets another dose of reality that somebody else says, like, okay, leave them be. Let's focus on the moment. And she's always struggling. And I find that, I don't know, compelling, but also human, you know, in the same sense that you mentioned before.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's that moment where, you know, in the climax of the present timeline where she pulls the mountainside down. And that's kind of that defining moment where, and once again, I was playing with that figuratively. The idea of dismantling the mountain from the top down is a response to all of this kind of trauma and pain that she's built up over the years. And so when she tears that down, that's meant to be that kind of moment of enlightenment where it's like, yeah, like, to look after everyone, I've got to look after myself, but I also have to just make sure I'm kind of doing it pretty prescriptively. Like, at some point I've got to stand back and not put my heart into every single person individually when I'm faced with this much, right? Like, you kind of just have to roll with the punches a little bit.
Yeah, and there is also an ongoing discussion on trust on both timelines, and not only the trust of those around you, even when they have different cultures, but also trusting her own abilities. She's always struggling. She's always, as you said, looking at everything like a half empty cup, and has this very perfectionist approach to herself. Like, we see her doing amazing stuff in the past timeline and in the present timeline. And for her, it's never enough.
I think with trust, I think what's interesting, and this comes from someone who is also a perfectionist, but you know, a lot of times trust can be worn down in relationships with other people if you don't trust yourself. And so what I wanted to show with Nisha is that the less she trusts herself, the more things spiral out of control. And because she's a perfectionist, if she lacks control and that situation's getting away from her, she can't handle it. So there's definitely that kind of stress where, there's kind of these physical stakes in the story, but at the end of the day, the stakes that are in her mind are really, for me, what I was trying to drive the plot with. And part of this was also, for me, a reaction to how I wrote her in book one. And this is not really a spoiler for book one, but in book one, she's more of a side character and she's in a mentorship kind of role. She does need to have stepped up quite a bit by then. And so I really wanted to show how she got there, because she's still pretty rough around the edges in that book. And I needed readers to see what that through line was, right? So trust in the book, the whole kind of idea of trust in the book is that if you don't trust yourself, trust is not going to reciprocate between you and another person either.
It's also sad because she trusted so many times, and through the novel we see character after character breaking the trust. First the parents, then the queen, who was also a very important mentor figure for her as well.
I was thinking about the queen, Faldra, and I think one of the interesting kind of things that's going on there is that Nisha has poured so much trust into that mentor figure, and it's nearly, it felt nearly unfair of me to take Faldra away from her, because that should have been that kind of curb, for a lot of Nisha's insecurities, is the queen. And so when that's removed, she doesn't have much left. And there is that idea of, at that point in her life where she became a sleeper, Faldra is really all she had. Colin is there, he's a mentor, he's her direct kind of report, but he's a bit kind of brash, he's hard to talk to. Yeah. She can't get on a deep level with him. Whereas with the queen, she kind of reflects on their relationship and they seem to get each other a little bit more. So when that goes away, that's incredibly hard. The other problem that she has is that she put too much into that relationship rather than focusing on herself. And so there's that idea of you really have to make sure as a person that you round yourself out. And part of this is reflected, I know you're probably going to ask me about the tree later, but part of this is reflected in the structure of the tree, right? So the tree, the great tree is split into 3 divisions. You've got the heart, the mind, and the soul. And it's based on essentially Plato's theory of the soul. So that classical kind of Greek idea that the soul cannot exist without the heart to feel and the mind to reason. And so Nisha is a reflection of a person who doesn't have all 3 of those things.
Yeah.
It's also another reason why the sleepers live in the mind primarily. They're there to do governance of the people, but a lot of times that means that they lack the empathy to kind of see their shortcomings, right? So there's that level of it as well. Yeah.
It's also a bit heartbreaking, like Eldra could actually have changed Nisha's life. And it's also ominous in the sense of seeing how much your own actions or the actions of a single person can affect so deeply another. We see Nisha just after, when she finds out, she goes from denial to this is not happening, to anger, to feeling sad, and all of these emotions that she can't handle, and then shut them up completely. They are gone in a moment, and she goes back to being how she was before at the start of the book, that very grown-up child.
Yeah, and that's kind of that moment in the story where we say all is lost, right? Like, how is the character going to come back from this? And I think what I was trying to do in that scene as well was show by contrast what Prisma was like. Prisma is obviously experiencing the same emotions as Nisha, but she doesn't let them overcome her. At the end of the day, every single person that's running out of that magisterium at the moment where the queen kind of arrives and starts to take over, everyone's feeling the same thing as Nisha. But Nisha's primary thinking is that her feelings matter the most. And that's a problem, right? Because she can't get to the core of her responsibility. Even for Colin, I think what I wanted to do with him was show Nisha that even though he's this rough guy, he's pretty hard to kind of get on board with, but even he is able to curb his emotions. Colin has a tremendous amount of respect for the queen, obviously is in disbelief about what's happened as well, but he's able to manage that and do what he needs to do. And so, hopefully you think that Nisha is going to kind of respond to all that stimuli and how people are acting, but she doesn't. And I think I was also thinking about, there's that cliche saying in Spider-Man, right? Like, with great power comes great responsibility. And she definitely doesn't have that concept. She doesn't have those 2 things put together in her mind. Part of that is because she rejects the fact that she has great power. She wishes she never had the great power. Part of that is because with responsibility comes the need to face yourself. And she doesn't have that either.
No, and I think it's because nobody taught her how to. Everybody is always telling her, you can do this, or you should try this, or you shouldn't feel this, instead of validating her and actually trying to teach her what she didn't learn as a child. And it just reinforces the feeling, because when Korn chastises her, she actually closes herself even more, and goes more into the denial of, I can't do this. Which, again, it felt like those coping mechanisms, or going back to what she sadly learned when she was a child.
And this is realistic. Like, this is the psychology of children in many ways. Like, in my professional life, I'm a primary school teacher, and the number one thing that, and I tell the kids this as well, the number one thing that I try to do in the classroom is to celebrate their success. Because the second that you take that away, chastising a child because they've done the wrong thing is not necessarily going to get you the answer that you want. It's also not going to teach them anything. In fact, it's going to make them push away more. So they need a place to go back to for validation. And I think that's what I wanted to show in Nisha, is this is a child that should have been looked after a lot more. The way that she was looked after, even after becoming a sleeper, was nowhere near good enough. At the same time, there are elements of her personality where she should have done better as well, but she did not necessarily have the means to get there.
Something that I really liked how you managed it is that even when you are jumping between timelines, because that's how the book is written, it feels consistent, like both stories are interwoven, and as you are exploring her past, you get to understand why she behaves in one way in the future, and again into the past, and more gets revealed. And it also speaks of the complexity of people. They see her in the future in the present timeline, actually, as this very powerful person. And she feels completely different. And if you only take that, she has no grounds to actually feel that way. But then when you explore the past line, it makes sense. And it was woven in a very nicely way.
Oh, thank you. I think I was reflecting a bit on characters from Brandon Sanderson's books. I don't know if you've read any Brandon Sanderson.
I'm a fan of the Stormlight Archive.
Yeah, you do like the Stormlight Archive?
I love it, yeah.
The Stormlight Archive is one of my favorite series ever, and Words of Radiance is probably my favorite book in recent history, I think, in terms of sci-fi fantasy. But I think something that Brandon does well in Stormlight is he grows a lot of his characters out beyond their basic traits. Whereas on the flip side, and this is probably like in Mistborn, right? I don't know if you've read the Mistborn books. One of the reasons I don't like Mistborn as much is that the characters there never seem to grow beyond their initial traits. They seem kind of, to me, like they're always held or bound by something that he's told us about them at the start of the series. So their development feels stunted. And to me, it meant that the ending wasn't as satisfying. The redemption wasn't as big, besides one key character, which I won't talk about because it's a major spoiler for that series. But, in the rest of the gods, I think what I wanted to do with Nisha was show a situation where there are traits she can't grow beyond. And that's real of all people, but I also wanted to show that there were places where she saw the light or she saw a way to move beyond that. And so there are clear redemption moments in the present timeline, but I wanted to really end on a resonant note by finishing the novella in the past. And actually, I'd be interested to know what your thoughts were about that, because that was something I was struggling with when I was writing the story was, am I doing the right thing by ending this on such a bleak note?
It was quite sore, but I think it fit her perfectly. It rounded up her thoughts at the end. And the conversation, even if it happens in the past, it still provides some kind of closure to the present timeline because of how the events are interwoven. I really liked it ending in the past rather than in the future. It felt like the future was there and it didn't need to go further than that ending, which was quite a cliffhanger as well.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Yeah, that was something that I was really trying to determine was how much do I want her to grow beyond these things that hold her back, and how much do I want the reader to kind of reflect on how hard it is for someone in her position to grow beyond those things, you know? So it's about getting that balance there.
And I think you did it very well, honestly. So before you mentioned that the Great Tree was actually based on a bit of ancient philosophy and Plato, and I was going to ask, how did you come up with that concept?
My first degree when I came out of high school was a Bachelor of Liberal Arts. And so when you do a Bachelor of Liberal Arts, I guess the key premise of that is an integration of literature, philosophy, history, and science, right? And so the philosophical part of my degree, especially right at the beginning, was looking at Platonic philosophy. Plato, as we know, is a student of Socrates. But Plato had a lot of theories, but the concept of the soul, to me, is the one that resonated with me the most when I was a student, because, and part of this is because I grew up religious, right? So there is that aspect where, you know, I'm thinking about that as well. At the same time, the idea that without a soul, we're not human is very important. I think to all of us, right? It doesn't matter whether you're religious or not, but there's something about a human that makes us different to an animal, right? There's that ability to reason. When I was putting together Aobia, I really wanted to figure out a way to make these people interesting on a societal level by considering the relationship they have with the tree, and then considering how the tree embodies the three aspects of the soul according to Plato, and then how the people live that out subconsciously. So there is kind of a philosophy there. It's more in the background for me so that I can orchestrate the story, but that's kind of how I came up with it. How the people actually live it out is obviously entirely different. You'll see characters who are very well-formed people, and you'll see characters that aren't, who are living in different parts of the tree, and that doesn't really matter as much. But the idea that there are these three areas really plays into their society, and that goes back to what I was saying before about the magisterium, and how Nisha and the other sleepers all live in the mind, and there's a very distinct separation between them and the people who live in the heart and the soul. The people who live in the heart and the soul are the common people, and the common people are who I resonate with, right? That they're the people that all of us resonate with, and that's part of the reason why I wanted Nisha to be that bridge between the common people and the upper class, because I think it's important sometimes to see how hard it is for people, sometimes in the upper class, to do the right thing. Part of it is because they're so kind of narrow-minded by their overall vision. They've got a good vision, they've got good intentions, but carrying it out can be so difficult if you don't have a perception of how everybody else is reacting to what you do.
Regarding that division of the three parts in the tree, something that actually amazed me is that it represents classes or different societal levels, but it doesn't feel classicist. They are an integrated society that they move from one side to the other. There is an understanding that the magisterium is different level, but it felt integrated and it didn't feel, the classical society of they are very separate pieces.
I think it's interesting that you say that, because for Nisha, and this is part of why I had her perspective, right? Like as a child, she wouldn't be aware of differences in class either. So, and look, on a realistic level, the people who live in the heart and soul are very similar to one another. But the people in the soul tend to celebrate art more. They tend to, that's where you go for the marketplaces and stuff like that. And so there's very literal connections that I make with that. But with the mind, eventually I want to actually publish a map of the tree itself, but the mind is situated higher in the tree. And so there is a bit of a literal connection there in terms of how the magisterium is viewed and how they view others. And it's a problem. Yeah. It's actually going to be a problem that comes back, and it's a crucial part of the main conflict in the main series as well.
That's interesting that you say that, because we get the whole story through Nisha's eyes, so the narrator is very biased, and that doesn't mean that there aren't any problems, just that in this part of a story, she doesn't see it.
Yeah, and I think that's really important. Like sometimes when we think about the unreliable narrator, we put so much stock into them being,
tricksters,
incorrect because it's their intention. Yeah. But like with Nisha, I didn't want her to be actively telling the story incorrectly. I just wanted us to see the story through her eyes, and a combination of her naivety and her self-imposed ignorance, like we were talking about before, builds the world from her perspective. When you see it from someone else's perspective, it might look entirely differently.
Yeah, and that also happens in real life.
Exactly.
Like two people living at the same time in different countries, and they will see life completely different. Something else with the tree and the Aeolians, they are very attuned with the tree and they feel it even. And on this scene towards the end, when they go out of a tree, almost out of the canopies and everything, Nisha makes some comments as if she feels out of it or disconnected. So I wanted to ask you more about that, if it's only a perception or if they really have that connection.
Yeah, this is a good question. I think there's a few aspects here. There's a spiritual aspect, and the spiritual argument says that if Nisha is spiritual in the sense that we have religion in our world, then she can believe that whether it's real or not. At the same time, there is a science behind the workings of the tree, which I don't want to go into all the details of because I don't want to spoil the entire series. But as part of my research for the series, I read a book called The Hidden Life of Trees. I don't know if you've heard of it. Yeah, it's a really good book. It's by a guy called, I think you say his name, Peter Wolleben, I think is how you say his name.
Yeah.
I could be completely wrong. I hope I didn't butcher that. But essentially, there's some ideas in that book which link life in forests to trees via symbiosis. And there are some real things that are playing out between the Aeolians and the tree, but they're not aware of it. At the same time, there's also a spiritual aspect of, well, I do want people to have the autonomy in this world to choose whether they believe in something greater or not. Because that's reality, right? And so you see Colin is kind of like this overzealous believer because he has to be. That's kind of how he gets by. But Nisha doesn't resonate with that. And I think that's completely natural. I think a lot of spirituality is fueled by questioning. So you have to kind of question what you believe to get to the core of whether you think it's true or not. And I want her character to be a picture of that, because that's a reality for a lot of people. Whereas the overzealous person, especially when you meet these kind of people in real life, you feel like you can't get closer to them because they've got that kind of holier than thou attitude.
Yeah.
It's part of the reason why the intro quote to the novella is what I picked for it. So that first quote that I've got on the very front page is, "Do your duty and leave the rest to the gods." And that's where I got the title from. That's from a play called Horace by Pierre Corneille. And it's a French play that was written hundreds of years ago. ago, but essentially that play is kind of a retelling of the story of Horace in Rome. It's about a battle between two families, and essentially this gets said to the main character: do your duty and leave the rest of the gods. And the main character chooses to kind of embrace ambiguity, chooses to also embrace himself and what he's good at, and use his, I guess, God-given talent, so to speak, to emerge victorious at some point in the story. And so I wanted that quote there to kind of be a constant contrast between Nisha and other people who just kind of choose to just believe in it, right?
And they also, even if the Aeolians don't have that attitude of holy than thou, they do have some bias towards the other races, especially towards the humans who appear,
Absolutely.
at least from what is hinted in this book. They don't have that connection to the tree, and it's like more of a, not segregating them, but not considering them at the same level. And we can see that in the chat at the end, in the last chapter that goes back to the past, there is a different relationship between them, and how the human makes a mistake on the title and then Nisha berates him in her mind, like downplaying him even.
Absolutely. And like, and I wanted that moment to be really important because, or to punctuate this, because this is the king, right? This is the king of Adira. He's a pretty bigwig, you know, like, and Nisha's kind of sitting there in her mind, as you say, berating him for making a mistake. He actually just has no clue how her society works. He's so naive, and that naivety, once again, is something that he chooses, and that a lot of humans in this world actively choose. And part of that is part of an ongoing conversation, I guess, that will come up in the rest of the series. But one of the driving themes here is colonialism. So if you have a look at the chapter headings in this book, each chapter gives you the year, but then underneath it says, right next to the year, it says AS, and that stands for after settlement. I think part of this is my wanting to explore this more as an Australian person, thinking about how colonialism has affected our country and what we are today. And also, you know, wanting to share, I guess, a deep respect that I have for the original people that I hope everybody has, but it's just not the way the world works, unfortunately. But I think, you know, the Aobians are like that, right? They're the original custodians of this land, and they innately understand it. They innately understand how to care for it. And in Australian society, we've got that as well, right? Like the Aboriginal people innately understand how to care for the land. And we don't see that. Even today, like we just don't see it. We try to understand, or people say they try to understand, but they don't. And so that's part of that. Yeah, not segregation so much, but they just don't get each other, you know? The Aobians don't understand the humans don't understand them. Both parties kind of don't want to choose to understand the other one either. They just want to coexist so that there's no fighting. Yeah.
And they also come from different places, while the Aoian, you know, it's good that you mentioned the Aboriginals in Australia, because when I was reading it, I thought the same thing about the Aoians. They seem to have this culture of respect towards the environment, to trying to work in tandem with it, while the humans are, of course, always being humans. They want to overpower the world and use it as a resource. And the contrast is very clear during the present timeline, when they talk about the humans, and during the final conversation as well.
I was just thinking there's a pastoral care that the Aobians have for the land, and you do see this a lot more in book one, but that pastoral care is just part of who they are. It's completely part of who they are. Whereas the humans, as you say, they've gone there to seek power, you know, or to seek some kind of alternate life that they've built up in their minds that's not necessarily, you know, going to give them anything that they really truly desire. So there's definitely that contrast.
We don't get that much of a contrast with the Nestlers. It feels like the Aoians and the Nestlers, they actually get along and understand each other. Would you like to elaborate a bit more on them?
Yeah, there's a few things there. The first thing is very simple, which is that as a kid, I loved the Red Wall books, and I loved anything with anthropomorphic animals. So Watership Down was another big one. I also love Mrs. Frisbee and the Rats of Nim. I don't know if you've heard of that one. That's a great book and a really good movie as well. But all of these stories for me just captured that sense of imagination and escapism in fantasy. So reading Red Wall as a kid just really spoke to me. So there was part of that where I wanted to figure out a way to inject that into an adult fantasy series. At the same time, the more realistic thing with the Nestlers is that they are, again, an original custodian of the land. So they've been there forever, and they've shared the land with the Aeobians for different purposes. But once again, they've got that natural ability to nurture and tend for the environment around them, and they've got a deep respect for the environment around them. But it's very different to the Aeobians, and I won't go into too many details because I haven't revealed it fully. But there are nestlers and there are burrowers, and the nestlers do live in trees, but they don't live in trees like the Aeobians. They just live in normal trees. And then the burrowers actually live underground. And so they've kind of got this cyclical way of looking after the earth, which you'll find out more about in future books.
I honestly can't wait. Everything that you say makes it just more interesting. But we only talked about 3 of the races, and in the book it's mentioned that there are 4.
So you got the humans, so you got the Aeobians, and then you got the hidden ones. And the hidden ones are broken into 2 peoples. They are slightly different to one another. Like they have very different, I guess, cultures. They, in some cases, even speak slightly different languages. So I've made references to them having slightly different accents and stuff like that. And Nisha's not really quite sure. They kind of all seem the same, but not. And so, yeah, they do interact quite often, but it's nearly like having 2 nations living underground and living above the ground is kind of the idea that I had. Yeah.
I did pick up that about the language. Kafdil always speaks in third person, and they all seem to speak like that. I felt it like they were trying to translate their language. You know, I'm bilingual, and I always feel that sometimes some things that sound reasonable in Spanish, they are unusual in English sometimes. And the way you wrote them, it felt like they were speaking not their native tongue, they were speaking a different one, and this is how it translated. It gave them it gave them this personality of a culture, you know, like the shared culture between them on top of the individual personalities, you know.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I think, with them, like there's kind of 2 answers there. Like initially I was doing it in a bit of a cutesy way. Like I wanted them to come across as very charming. And I thought that was a fun way to kind of, just make them fun, you know, fun anthropomorphic creatures. At the same time, I think you're completely right. Like there are these language barriers that I wanted to be realistic. So I do want to show off those language barriers more actually with some of the other humans. So you'll see a bit of that with Therador when you actually hear from them a little bit more later in the series too. Yeah.
There was something else that I wanted to ask you regarding the races, going back to the tree and all of that. They are quite protective, you know, or against some of the discoveries that humans brought in. Like it's very visible with the fire, and it makes sense because they are on a tree. But it also, the way Nisha and everybody else talks about it, it's like, this is this ugly thing the humans brought in. It's more than a danger, you know, it's something very repulsive even. That's how she feels it or how it reads.
I wanted to paint a picture of a world where I was thinking about how, you know, we always say that the two things that humans first invented were the wheel and fire. And I was thinking about a world in which fire could not be invented because it would be viewed as destructive to the environment. And that is this world. At the same time, the Aeobians, and I've hinted at this in one section in the book, that they are nomads, right? So they've kind of crossed the land in many different tribes and cultures and eventually settled in these trees. And so they have encountered fire before because it's a natural cleansing, but haven't embraced it as a tool. So that's kind of where I was thinking with that.
It really felt this way. They really didn't appreciate, you know, the things that the human brought in. And it made it feel more that there were tensions between the races. It added into the present timeline. You can see that whatever happened or triggered the war that we don't really know comes in from several years ago or even more.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and I think there's also this idea of self-imposed boundary. Like they want to preserve their culture. And so they tend to not step out of the tree unless they have to. And so the only reason that Aeobians would leave the tree are to make diplomatic negotiations with other nations. And that's because they want to keep the peace. And so the forefront war is exactly that conflict, right, coming to a head. It's a pretty big deal for these people because they have to leave their home. And once again, that kind of goes back to what I was thinking in the Australian connection there as well. I was trying to really think about how it would feel to uproot someone from their home in that way.
Yeah.
And Nisha being uprooted from her home as a child is a very small reflection of the people being uprooted from the tree to have to fight this war.
Yeah. And the tree also has some effects on them because they have this limitation of being outside of it for only, I think, a month. And even when they leave the canopies towards the end, it's implied that she feels something, that she's losing something for living.
The tree is linked to how long they live, but that's all I'll say.
Yeah, that's fine. It's been a terrific discussion. So if you liked it, please consider subscribing to my podcast, Books Undone, and liking this video. Also, before we leave, I want to give a shout out to Esme Rosalind from Before We Go blog, who kindly sent some of the questions we touched in this discussion. So Joshua, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Livia. In terms of where to find me, you can find me on Twitter at jwalkerwrites, Instagram at jlw.author, and on my website, joshuawalkerauthor.com. And if you head there and sign up to my mailing list, you can actually get the rest of the gods for free as a digital download as well. So if you do like the sound of it after this, I know we've spoiled a little bit of it, but if you do like the sound of it after this, go ahead and give it a try.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So you will find all the links he mentioned in the description and also links to my own writing. I hope you enjoyed it. So thank you so much for listening and happy reading.